Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new webinar from the Consumer Center. This first of the series that we're going to run for November till the end of the year. This webinar will be on the important issue right now of illicit trade and how it will affect consumers. Very unfortunately, one of our speakers has a health problem, so MEP Gancha cannot join, and we wish her full recovery very soon. And I'm going to present our three speakers, and we're going to start. The first speaker that I want to present is Anthony Himsley. He's the External Engagement Director at Japan Tobacco International. Together with him in the panel today, we will have Jeff Hardy, Director General of the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, TRACIT, and Giacomo Bandini, Director General of Computer Institute in Rome. I will start immediately asking one question to Anthony, because as consumers right now, we are facing a lot of issues when it comes to illicit trade. Just a few weeks ago, we have seen a lot of problems coming with the pandemic and illicit trade. A lot of, for example, of face masks, which are really important right now, coming from Eastern countries such as China or Vietnam, being smuggled illegally in Europe and be completely unaffected. And these masks are actually entering in our hospital, in our house. At the same time, we have seen most European countries in the last year actually trying to tackle some FMCG problems and not understanding that the way they were legislating was actually making consumers going to illicit market and not actually staying in the illicit market where we can actually buy products that are safe. Right now, JTI just published a very interesting report that I suggest all of you to read, which is Getting Storm report, which is the role of COVID-19 on the role of COVID-19 recovery. So after the pandemic and the illicit trade. So my first question would be actually if you, Anthony, could tell us how illicit trade is affecting private sector, especially during this pandemic, and in general, which challenge do you see from the illicit trade?
Thanks, Luca. And I think you've already seized upon a very important point, which is that the criminals involved in illicit trade are highly versatile and opportunistic. And as you say, during the pandemic, we've seen them very quickly move through their understanding of supply and demand with the networks that they already have established into supplying personal protective equipment. Because the demand was so high, the supply was limited, and preying on people's fears, society's fears. And we all know colleagues, friends, family that have ordered PPE online, and maybe it hasn't arrived, or if it has arrived, it's been defective. And again, another example where they've very quickly seen an opportunity and have exploited the surge in digitalization, this big movement towards ordering and shopping online because of lockdown, where the ability to discern between fake and real is so much harder. With really significant pressure now on society and on people in terms of disposable incomes, in terms of purchasing power, and with growing unemployment, the risk is that more and more consumers will either knowingly or unknowingly move and turn towards counterfeit or untaxed products. And all this will do is will further embed criminality into our societies. Now, the World Economic Forum estimates that $2.2 trillion are lost every year in illicit trade and counterfeit. And the International Chamber of Commerce says that by 2022, that will be $4 trillion. And the danger here is that we'll see more consumers becoming complicit with illicit trade. And this isn't a victimless crime. The criminals involved in illicit trade are very much behind human trafficking, modern day slavery, in addition to what we already know around organized crime and terrorism. So there's a real need to educate consumers and government around the risks behind this. And a lot of this has been picked up in the report that you mentioned that we published, The Gathering Storm, which looks at how illicit trade in tobacco products has operated during the pandemic, how criminals have used social media, and how they've been stockpiling counterfeit products and illegal products in anticipation of a windfall post-pandemic, because they believe that tax increases will be inevitable. And if I may, I'd just like to give a couple of examples, because in some countries where we've seen border controls strengthen because of lockdown during the pandemic, we've actually seen legitimate sales increase, which in turn has delivered an increase in excise receipts for governments. And of course, some commentators are now saying that the lockdown, the pandemic, has resulted in an increase in smoking, which is simply not the case. What we've seen is a repatriation of purchasing from illicit trade back to the legal market. But in other countries, we've seen the opposite, where we've seen a surge in illicit trade, where we've even seen the prices of counterfeit and illegal cigarettes increase because the demand has increased. And South Africa is a good example there, where the government in the early stages of lockdown banned the sales of tobacco products and alcohol, and we saw 100% of sales moving into the illegal market, depriving the government of all excise revenue, and further establishing criminality in the society there, which now is actually very difficult to dismantle because it's established, because smokers and drinkers have become accustomed to purchasing the products cheaper and illegally. The effort to try and eradicate that is much more difficult. And in that environment, we're now seeing some commentators praising the actions of South Africa and suggesting that thousands of smokers have given up, which is just simply not true. They're only looking at what the legal sales are, which are grossly reduced from where they should be. And this is a major problem that we face, that those that continue to push for excessive tax increases, not just tax increases, but excessive ones, or excessive forms of regulation, are conveniently ignoring the realities of illicit trade and illegal activity. And it has to be part of thinking when we look at regulation and we look at excise. We know that governments are cutting enormous checks to support economies during the pandemic. So it is inevitable that efforts will have to be made to stimulate economic recovery and recoup the money that's been spent. And we know, for example, in the UK, that the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that the government there will have to introduce substantial tax increases by the middle of the decade in order to stand a chance of recouping some of the debt. But we have to make sure that those tax rises are moderate, that they don't actually destabilize economic recovery, and actually do the reverse and push all the growth into counterfeit and illegal trade, rather than generating tax revenue. And we've already seen that, for example, in Russia, where the government has rapidly moved to try and introduce a 20% tax increase on tobacco products, And that's surely going to drive illicit trade. And that's exactly what we know the criminals are waiting for. They're waiting for a bumper payday, and we have to avoid that. Especially as other forms of taxation are going to come in, where we see these unique opportunities that society are referencing, whether it's to tackle climate change or obesity. The temptation and ease with which taxes could be introduced is clear. We just need to make sure that there's a holistic approach to how this is managed, so that we don't compound the problems that individuals in society are experiencing in terms of affordability and in terms of pressure on income. And in actual fact, we need to encourage governments to go and look for the revenue elsewhere, not to continue to mine the same ground, go to the same source of revenue, whether that's income tax, sales tax, excisable goods, but go after the trillions of dollars that are being lost every year and that are currently sitting in the criminals' pockets.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. This was a really interesting topic, and you actually touched base something that I would like to come back later. For example, the South African example, the Russian one, and many other. But as we have Jeff, who is actually the director for a transnational alliance to combat illicit trade, I would like to ask him if he can give us some observation of what you have seen during this COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, we hear the points from the private sector. As you as an organization, what is your perception? What happened during this pandemic, and how the states actually reacted to the growth of illicit trade?
Yeah, thanks, Luca. Be happy to do that. I've got some slides, I think, that might help a little bit. Let's just present it like that. It's easier for me than to go to the full screen. But let me take 2 seconds to get started first to tell you a little bit about Trace It, because we're looking at the illicit trade issue across all sectors. For example, Anthony was speaking about the problems with illicit trade in tobacco sector, and you'll see that one of our icons addresses tobacco. I'm also going to talk about alcohol and counterfeiting primarily, and pharmaceuticals later in the presentation. So we're designed to look at the at illicit trade across the many sectors, and we concentrate typically on where there are common vulnerabilities. So you can see from this slideshow, it's how the illicit traders exploit, maritime transport, for example, how they're moving into exploiting small consignments through express carriers. The internet, we're going to talk about a lot, but wherever there are weaknesses is where the illicit traders tend to gain their advantage. And so these 2 slides give you an idea of the breadth of the topics that we work at and where we tend to focus. But just jumping to your question, I think sometimes during the pandemic, everyone wants to make more out of the situation than is really the case. Unquestionably, there have been impacts on illicit trade during the pandemic, but I don't think it's fair to say all of the sectors have been significantly impacted. Anthony, gave a great presentation on what's happening in tobacco, in particular in countries like South Africa, where there have been government-mandated prohibitions, have really just tipped the scales and caused a legitimate surge in counterfeiting activity. The other 2 places that I wanted to highlight in the slides are the personal protective equipment, what's commonly called PPE, and alcohol. These sectors, alcohol is very similar to what happened with tobacco, but in many more countries where governments, grappling with measures to enforce social distancing had included prohibitions on alcohol. And what that did is that just well, it eliminated any form of legal sales and driving the illicit demand and the supply into the into the illegal, unregulated, unhealthy markets. The other big observation that probably most everyday people are familiar with is the PPE. There was a surge in fake masks, as you can imagine, and hand sanitizers, and anything that had to do with human being trying to protect themselves from the virus. And organizations like Europol, for example, had charted the numbers. The offerings on illicit platforms skyrocketed by thousands of percentages, as people scrambled to try to protect themselves. I think just, looking into the future, what we're going to see is as remedies start to become available, this is where the illicit traders and counterfeiters are going to move next, playing on fears. Across the board, just a couple things I wanted to mention is the biggest lessons that we learned, or what are the biggest observations that COVID-19 exposed. And I think, my main takeaway there is it's a lot of the things that we've been trying to tell policymakers for a long time. That the role of criminal involvement is not just a story that advocates are telling to try to make change. I mean, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, for example, has reported that, this has been an unforeseen global growth in criminal activity as they've moved into markets that were shut down by governments or shut down by social distancing. So I think that's the main observation. This isn't a joke. There is organized crime is significant. I think the other thing that we've been trying to tell policymakers is that illicit trade and counterfeiting, these are not harmless crimes. I think some parties like to write this off and say, well, these are harmless crimes. Who's harmed by this? And the cases we've seen, at least I'll go to the alcohol example, is more than 1,000 deaths recorded, and that number is growing in countries like India or South Africa, Turkey, Dominican Republic, Mexico, really around the world. So, these are real lessons learned, sadly, but truly highlighted by the pandemic. And I think the last observation really comes to, one of the missions of your organization is that this is a reminder that illicit trade is as much about fraud, consumer fraud, as it is about anything else. And what we're seeing is, this opportunistically taking advantage of consumers that are trying to protect themselves, trying to feed themselves. So those are the main observations that I had.
Thank you, Jeff. It was very interesting, and actually you touched base on very important topics, and I think we will come back on some of them later. But just to go to Giacomo for 1 second, I would like to ask something that none of the other two speakers have talked about is the pharmaceutical and drugs illicit trade. So one of the main problems that we have seen during the pandemic, of course, are the PPEs, fake PPEs entering European or American markets. But it's not the only case. It was reported some months ago that in Africa, in Northern Africa, a huge amount of fake medicine enter some countries there, such as Morocco, Egypt, and others, and they're actually not helping people, but making them in danger. And this is not just a risk for consumers, but it's also a risk for everything related to intellectual property. Compete has a quite big studies on this. So if you can tell us more, what are the risks for intellectual property products and related to illicit trade?
Yes, thank you, Luca. Of course, illicit trade has a huge correlation with IP rights and with IP rights protection. before talking about just about intellectual property as a whole, I would like to highlight what are the main problems related to intellectual property violation. In general, we should say that intellectual property helps to secure returns on investments with regards to innovation, and in general, it heavily affects small and medium-sized organization which has less resources to dedicate to invest in intellectual property. Countries such as Italy, but in general, European countries could be particularly vulnerable to a situation of uncertainty and weakness in the protection of IP. And IP property rights infringement can produce several negative effects. The first one, it's like a general socio-economic and business effects, and it can lead to a loss of business revenue and reputation, and also a loss of competitive advantage by providing alternative sources of products and production processes with the opportunity, the possibility, chance of being identical to the original product. Of course, this is the case of illicit trade too. And also IP violation affects the innovation processes with significant consequences on growth, employment, and criminal activities, of course, such as counterfeiting and illicit trade. Another effect of IP violation is on the rights holders, of course, such as companies that produce, that invest resource, invest time in producing an original, good quality or high quality product. And there are also effects on the sales volume and prices, on brand value, and on the general overall firm reputation. Also, royalties are affected, and of course, it could be a waste and a huge loss of investment and cost. The third effects that illicit trade, and both illicit trade, I would say, and IP violation could have is on consumers, because it involves health and safety risk, and of course, consumers' utility, because fake products is not produced with the same standards and with the same quality of fake and reproducing, I would say, in general, fake products like a replication. And the one last effect that could have is, of course, on government, on society in general, especially when it affects tax revenues and could lead to major expenditures to combat counterfeiting as a policy. I will just highlight that I will just make the example of Italy, where the products that are more affected by the phenomenon of counterfeiting and illicit trade are the luxury goods, the electrical machinery and equipment, and also tobacco products. Well, this type of products, especially those of fashion, belong to the made in Italy category. And counterfeiting actually entails considerable damage to Italian brands whose value is recognized, is acknowledged all over the world, just thanks to the quality and the know-how behind the product itself. So I would say that a large part of this product in the Italian business environment are made by small and medium enterprises that are more vulnerable to IP violation, because they have less resources, and also they are less aware of the consequences of IP violation. So they tend to be less protected, and also they tend to hold less patents or to understand the value of registering, of applying for a patent and protecting the brands and whatever. Just to give some numbers, the loss caused to Italian companies by counterfeiting and illicit trade amounts to around 24 billion euros in just in 2016. Unfortunately, these are the last information, the last data available, but it's a huge amount, and it is like the 3.2% of all Italian exports for that year, especially the industry for clothing, footwear, and leather products was affected by illicit trade with a loss of 4 billion euros, but also food, beverage, and tobacco with 3.2 billion, and electronic and electrical equipments with a loss of 3.1 billion. So we are talking about a value loss, a huge value loss due to illicit trade, and as a consequence of illicit trade, also IP violation. That's why it is fundamental, important, very important to protect IP, to have regulations that protects IP, and also regulation that try to stop illicit trade and counterfeiting.
All right, thank you, Giacomo. You actually touched base some interesting point. I think all of you have done. And coming back to IP protection, I have a question for Anthony, because we have seen that during this year, the last few years, actually, in European Union, but not only European Union, branding bans and plain packaging on tobacco products, but not only. We are now discussing some country plain packaging on alcohol. So tobacco is just the beginning, I would say, as a method to actually tell consumer to stop smoking or stop drinking or stop doing whatever could be, let's say, harmful in a way for them. But we have seen also a lot of records that do not show on data, do not show that consumers are actually stop smoking. Australia is probably the best example of this. So my question is actually if you can explain how branding ban is and plain packaging are actually boosting illicit trade, and if you have data from countries which implemented branding bans and how consumers switch from illicit market where you can buy tobacco, alcohol, which is actually, let's say, safe, to illicit market where we don't know what we actually are gonna buy.
Sure, and just to pick up on some of the points that Giacomo and Jeff mentioned as well. Going forward, coming out of the pandemic, the life of the brand owner is going to be tougher. As I mentioned, the pressure on income and the choices that consumers are going to make are going to change. So there will be a drive to cheaper alternatives. We'll see a rise in generics. And indeed, we'll see consumers moving or being attracted to illicit products. And one of the fundamentals for brands is to be able to provide cues to consumers that enable the consumer to differentiate between a real product, a fake product, to have trust and know that they're buying the brand that they trust and they value. And of course, plain packaging removes those cues. It infantilizes adults and the choices that they make. Certainly from the tobacco perspective, it's a failed experiment. It's excessive in terms of regulation. It's not particularly based in evidence or science, and just creates further opportunities for criminals. I mean, we live in an era where we find it difficult to understand fake from real, whether that's fake news on the internet or whether that's products that are available for sale. So to take away important branding that enables consumers, retailers, and others to work with brands just doesn't seem to make any sense. It offers the criminals carte blanche to go out and counterfeit plain packaging. And as you mentioned, Luca, it really doesn't impact whether or not an adult smokes, whether or not they change that decision. It actually just impacts what they smoke. And we've seen Australia was the first country to introduce plain packaging, had no counterfeit product in the market. Following plain packaging, counterfeits arrived. And the criminals are looking towards the opportunities that regulators can create for them. And governments and regulators should not be creating further opportunities for criminals. The reality is adults that choose to smoke are mainly going to continue to smoke. Some decide to give up, which is absolutely their choice, but some will continue to smoke. And we have a choice. The choice is that those products can be supplied to the individuals that want to smoke by responsible manufacturers that take product quality seriously, that operate within the law, that are legitimate, that contribute billions in tax, or that demand can be supplied by criminals and all the tax revenue is lost, and they don't care about product quality, and they don't care about to whom they sell the products. Now, that may not be a palatable choice for everybody, but that is the choice.
Thank you, Anthony. That was very interesting, and I would like to touch bit on the point that everyone has a choice, and policymakers should actually allow us to have this choice. To make a question to Jeff, which is during this pandemic, if governments around the world, I think about European government, North American government, but also South Asia and Australia and New Zealand government have done anything to tackle the problem of illicit trade, or actually they decided, I don't know, have improved the customs control, or actually they have not done anything and unintentionally they actually boosted all of the illicit trade and the problem that we discussed till now. Jeff, you're mute. You're mute. You have to unmute yourself.
You figure after 6 months of Zooming, we would remember to turn our microphone on, but anyway, that's the lesson learned from the pandemic. Turn your microphone on. Listen, there's a lot in that question that you just asked. I mean, I think for the most part, we've talked about some exceptions. In my earlier presentation, I talked about, that the PPE is exceptional. What's happening with illicit trade in alcohol and to a lesser extent in tobacco are exceptional. I think, the number one situation is that this is a problem that existed before the pandemic. It's becoming inflamed during the pandemic, and it's potentially creating some long run problems for legitimate countries to regain, their market shares, as Anthony mentioned earlier. So, for us, the main thing is it's a reminder that we need to get back to the basics. That we have, the industry at least, or organizations like mine, organizations like yours, have for a long time been telling governments that this is a priority. We've invested a lot in our messages in trying to make policymakers understand why this needs to be a priority. So I mean, maybe there's a slide I can show that adds a little bit to what you're talking about. And I think that there were two lessons, one of which involves government and one of which involves e-commerce. And, what we're seeing, I think for me, at least, the lesson is that we have been telling governments and policymakers that enforcement is the key. Prioritizing the fight against intellectual property rights protection or other forms of illicit trade has to be done. You know, so many governments have laws on the books, they have regulations on the books, but they're not enforcing them. This is the number one, point we make year after year, policy paper after policy paper, is that enforcement needs to become a priority. And I think what we saw with I mentioned the surge in fake face masks and hand sanitizers and other PPEs, is that you did have the US government border control leap into action. Europol leaped into action. Interpol, the World Customs Organization, they saw this as a major, major problem and undertook the types of enforcement and awareness campaigns that I had never seen them do before. And I think, the takeaway there is that when they prioritize a problem like this, the outcomes can be effective. So I just wish that fighting illicit trade was always such a priority. And once this pandemic, calms down, that's what we're going to get back to doing, is showing them that their actions can have payoffs. And the other thing is, you didn't ask me about government, but I'm just going to go ahead and jump in on the online problem. And perhaps all the other panelists, we can talk about this a little bit, is that, this is the problem of counterfeits and illicit products online is not new. The projections into the future that people will increasingly shop online is not new. What we saw during the pandemic, though, is a peek into the future. That these projections for growth of online shopping and growth of counterfeits available online is true. This is what the future looks like. And the lesson we have to take away during the pandemic is our house is not in order. The e-commerce platforms and the regulations and controls on the e-commerce platforms is not in order. And there is a long, long way and very many difficult choices that have to be made for us to make sure that, these projections, don't come true as consumers rely more and more on online shopping. So, at Trace It, we certainly have a number of policy recommendations to fix that problem. But I'm going to turn back to you, Luca, for now.
Thank you, Jeff. Actually, online, I saw we have some questions from the audience, so I will come back on doing the Q&A. And I want to touch base, connecting to what you just talked to, Giacomo. We have seen, as just said, a growing of illicit trade products online. And especially when it comes online, and speaking for experience from European Union, I'm not sure about other parts of the world, but I believe it's more or less the same. If a customs discover that you bought an illicit product on an online platform, not only the vendor and the seller is actually punished, but also the consumer. So in your study, have you seen why, what brings consumers and to go on the illicit trade, considering that the fine that you get to a fake Prada product online or luxury goods online is actually way more expensive than an original product? So if you have seen any patterns on why consumers are actually going to illicit markets?
Well, yes. Well, for sure, the price gap between the original product and the fake one is one of the main reasons. And about that, I would stress one more thing, that business conditions are very important in this case, because if you have good business condition in your country, and as Jeff mentioned, taxation, but not only taxation, I would say regulation in general, a regulation that can favor producers, that can favor brands, that can help them protecting their own brands, their own intellectual properties. This will affect positively businesses and production, and this can help them protecting their own products, protecting IP. This will also let them have less costs and invest more in protection. So when you have negative business condition, or when you have obstacles, administrative, bureaucratic obstacles for the producers, or obstacles to the productions, of course, this will increase the price gap and favor the illegal producers and also smugglers, and it will also favor counterfeiters. So business conditions are very important, are fundamental. It is in business condition has a huge impact in the price gap. And the second thing, the second one that I will mention about consumers is education and social acceptance in general. Social acceptance could be a main driver of the illicit trade around the globe in general. In many countries, and I come from Italy, and I could confirm that for my country, I would say so. Consumers often do not understand that buying illicit products is part of a criminal activity. So consumers often tend to think that buying a fake product, it's just a good deals, but they do not have any understanding of the consequences, both on the social and on the economic side, that this way of behaving as on society in general. And I would also add that the less informed consumer are more inclined to buy illicit products. So as a policy recommendation that I would make to politics, to the regulators, to institutions in general, is to cooperate with the private sector, with brands and companies, to bring forward, to implement communication activities, to invest in communication and in raising awareness among consumers, and I would say to teach them, but it's not appropriate. I would say just to raise awareness among them that buying illicit products, that behaving that way is not only a criminal action, is not only favoring a criminal action, but has huge consequences for the economy and could harm brand. And I'm saying this as an Italian, it will harm also made in Italy, which is something greater, which is something that represents the whole country and the Italian products. So they are basically harming themselves as a nation, as a country. And yes, this is one of our policy recommendation that we trying to spread among policymakers, not only in Italy but also in Europe. Just to be transparent with consumers, with citizens, and try to educate them, but do that in cooperation with industry, with the companies and brands, and understand their position.
Luca, could I come in on that, please?
Yeah,
I think thank you. I think what Giacomo said is absolutely fundamentally correct and important, that government regulators have to sit down with all stakeholders to ensure that the regulatory environment it works and that it's proportionate and that unintended consequences are avoided. And you just can't exclude business from the debate, irrespective of what that business produces, because only then can you see and hear all views and understand whether or not the proposals being discussed could be successful. And to Jeff's point, fully agree. Enforcement is absolutely key. At JTI, we invest significant resources in supporting law enforcement and working with them, and it is a fundamental key to trying to resolve the problem. Of course, one of the other things we're trying to do is to prevent governments pushing the situation into a position where enforcement is needed. And then online, it's a borderless environment. So if we're struggling with illicit trade where we have borders in countries, we're going to have an almighty free-for-all online, which again demonstrates why we need workable, reasonable regulatory frameworks that protect consumers, but also support legitimate business. So there are many, many challenges that are there today that need to be looked at carefully.
Thank you, Anthony. And actually, to your points, I have some Q&A from our audience. I will ask you to be really fast on this because we have just 10 minutes left. The first question that I would like to ask is to the few of you, but I think especially Jeff and Anthony, you are probably on the topic, and it will be if you can quantify the harm for consumer caused by black market products or illicit trade products. I'm thinking, for example, what happened in US last year, a couple of years ago, with a vaping plug, where consumers, as they could not find products on the illicit market, went to buy illicit products and actually for vape, and actually that product was not safe for consumers. So if you have example of this, and if you can quantify maybe in some products the harm that has been done to consumers.
I'm happy to go first. I think that's a good example, Luca. Again, it's regulation is good. I'm not suggesting that regulation is bad, but it has to be workable, effective, proportionate. And in the US, there was a period of time where there was very little regulation, which meant that the doors were open for opportunists with vape and e-cigarette products. And then very quickly regulation came in, banning this, restricting that, taking flavors away, capping nicotine limits, whatever those happen to be. But this was after the demand had been created and existed. So it amounted to prohibition, which then provided more incentive for criminals. And then we ended up with this Avali crisis in the US, where we had defective products where the e-liquids contained THC and vitamin E acetate, which led to respiratory problems for the individuals that purchased these. So again, if there was a reasonable regulatory environment, that could have been prevented. But there was a gap between no regulation and the attempt to have quite an extreme regulation. And again, criminals don't care. They don't care what's in the product. They don't care who uses the product or the consequences of that. And whether it's cosmetics or food, consumables or electronics, and let's not forget, e-cigarettes are electronics. The consequences can be disastrous, from exploding batteries, causing personal injury, burning down people's homes. So that's why we need regulation, but regulation that's effective and reasonable.
Yeah, well, the case of the vaping in the United States is you know, it's an example of this. We've been telling governments and policymakers and consumers that the problem of illicit trade, or counterfeiting in particular, is no longer the luxury good product or the DVD that's sold on a street corner. We say that it's endless. Now, it's every product in every industry is vulnerable to fake and to counterfeiting. And I think the vape story just reminds everyone that that's true. That even a relatively new product that emerges on the market is vulnerable to counterfeiting if the criminal groups think that there's a profit, if that they think that they can, going back to my earlier point, if they think they can defraud the consumer. So, I mean, my part of the answer to this Frederick's question, let me introduce something a little bit different that we've discovered here at Trace It. What are main drivers for the consumers? Well, the main drivers for the consumers is false advertising. You know, advertising has always been a legal, legitimate way for companies to expose their brands and their products and to entice that consumer to purchase their product, right? That's why plain packaging is, you know, a problem. What we found in a recent study by Trace It is now the organized criminals and the counterfeiters are doing their own advertising. So they're taking advantage of social media platforms like Instagram or Facebook to sponsor advertisements that are a infringement of a company's copyright, because there's a picture, an image, say, of a Gucci bag or a Tommy Hilfiger t-shirt that's available, and that ad says 50% off, discount, Black Friday sale, whatever it is. And that person who's skimming through their Instagram account might click on that, and that link takes them directly to what we call a rogue website, which is constructed specifically to fraud a consumer and to get them to click on a link which may or may not deliver them a fake product, which may or may not steal their credit card information. So, you know, it's not just the old stories we've been telling that it's, you know, it's a difference in tax, a difference in, you know, trying to beat the price, differences in tax codes, sorry. Consumers trying to make a deal, but it's also about them being defrauded. And, you know, I know we're getting close to the end, and just one thing that I think really ties it into you guys hosting and why I wanted to participate is because in the end, so much more work needs to be done in the consumer protection area. So much more work needs to be done to let policymakers know that this is not necessarily about IP rights, but about consumer fraud. And intervening there on behalf of the consumers, you know, taken together with trying to protect the companies that are investing in these products, I think is a powerful 1-2 punch. So I'd like to see your organization work with us and help us, you know, make sure governments understand that it's the consumer protection that's at risk.
That's we would love to do, actually. We just published a policy paper on illicit trade. You will find it on our website. I suggest everyone who is interested in the topic to read it, where we have actually some policy suggestions. We are now presenting, unfortunately, just online to MEPs and MPs in different countries to try to make awareness of this topic. The last question, because we are really running out of time, and I will put two together, actually. Illicit trade online is treated quite, in some countries at least, is treated as illicit trade in Piazza San Marco in Venice, or on the corner shop in US or other countries. So the question is, should we treat that differently? As you just explained, I can just be on online and find this website that put me on Instagram and go to buy a fake Apple product, Apple Watch straps, thinking that it's an original one, or a Gucci bag. So should we have a different type of legislation for online goods, online illicit trade? and let's say normal ones, the ones that you have on the street. And the second question, and I conclude, is if you know any country which actually have successful fighting the illicit trade. I leave the floor to you.
I would just, may I jump in on the first question about differences or supposed differences between online illicit trade and physical and illicit trade down in the streets. I would say that the better solution is not to overrule, to overregulate the phenomena of illicit trade. It doesn't need two different regulations to fight illicit trade. It's just a matter of, it's just regulators should just adapt regulations to the changes in society. If illicit trade will move more on online, more on the internet, on fake website, just adapt the regulation, and that's it. Creating, providing, implementing too many rules and too many regulation is wrong. The risk is that then fighting illicit trade will be complicated, both for governments and the public sector and the private sector and producer and also consumers. That's my take.
Well, okay, listen, this is really similar to what I was saying before. You know, the clock has, we're past time. It's high time. Whatever analogy you want to use, the days of letting, you know, counterfeits and illicit trades, you know, roam freely on the internet are over. That has got to change. And it's not a question of different standards. It's a question of applying, you know, a lot of the rules, regulations, and penalties that already exist in the real world, but applying those online. And, you know, I think a lot of people are quick to blame the platforms, you know, and I mentioned earlier what's happening on Instagram and Facebook. You know, it's not Instagram and Facebook per se. It's the exploitation of these platforms. So the new rules need to extend to not just the protection of the fakes available online and the penalization of that activity, but rules that close the vulnerabilities of these platforms that are exposed. You know, Facebook is not outwardly facilitating counterfeiting, and neither is Instagram, but the way they're set up right now enables exploitation. So I think, you know, we want to raise everything to the same standards, and right now, you know, we've got a long way to go to bring regulation online up to the same level as where we have it, you know, in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I fully agree. It's been too slow. The priority from governments, understandably, has been around sales tax, excise tax for online sales. A belief that they were missing out on a revenue opportunity. And we're now seeing a catch-up play when it comes to consumer protection and enforcing the rules and regulations to protect consumers from illegal products that already exist. And very quickly on the second point, I think the best examples I can think of are where you have a huge emphasis on enforcement and resourced enforcement and a moderate approach to taxation and regulation. It's very rare. It doesn't remove illicit trade, but it keeps it at a reasonable level. And as I mentioned, we've seen that where we've got really strong border controls because of the pandemic. And maybe that is a lesson that we can learn, a positive one that we can learn going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, Anthony, and Giacomo, for this very interesting and helpful insight. As Consumer Choice Center, we will take from part of this webinar, and we will actually talk to our MEPs. We actually have intergroup at European Parliament on IP, brands, and innovation. So we are more than happy to actually take part of these insights and present to the MEP that we talk every day. Thank you very much, and to everyone who is watching us. Next week we will, as is the American election, US election, we will not have any webinar, and we will have one on DSM in 2 weeks. Thank you very much, and see you soon.